Welcome to another episode of Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, where certified financial planner Loren Sherman shares thoughts on having a healthy mind, body, and spirit, an abundance of wealth inside portfolios and out, and lessons learned from clients and mentors over the years.
Welcome back to another Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement. I am your host, Loren Sherman, and I'm really excited to share this particular episode with you with psychologist and behavioral finance expert, Dr. Daniel Crosby. I had the pleasure of meeting Daniel at a financial planning conference in Nashville over the summer, and his message immediately resonated with me. Something that really stuck with me was that while Daniel has a PhD and the academic background to view the world of finance through a truly unique lens, he also has a humble, unassuming way about him that makes him approachable and engaging all in one. Daniel is going to dive into his story, so I won't spoil anything there, but I will mention that he has written 3 New York Times bestsellers, and he has a podcast of his own where he interviews other thought leaders in the area of behavioral finance. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you can find plenty more from Daniel. We will have those linked in the show notes for you. And last, before we jump into the conversation, we might just be offering a special giveaway for this one, so keep your ears peeled for that too. So there you have it. Let's jump into the conversation with Dr. Daniel Crosby. First off, I'm thrilled to be having Daniel join us today. We're going to be covering his book, have some questions from that, and then also we had a lot of listener questions come in, so we're going to cover those as well as we can. And, I typically, you don't know this, Daniel, but I typically like to start with a story. So instead of telling my story, I'm going to give you the opportunity, if you wouldn't mind, to share a little bit about your story.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate the honor. So my story, like my professional story, begins, I guess, when I was, freshman in college. My dad is a financial advisor, so I went to college, with an eye to becoming a financial advisor because I thought, he did good work, he made good money, he helped people, seemed like a good gig. So I went to college with an eye to becoming a financial advisor, but after my first year in college, I left for 2 years to be a missionary for my church. And so I spent 2 years in the Philippines and in Manila and surrounding areas. And, that just really changed me. Like I saw poverty on a level I hadn't seen before. I devoted my life full time to trying to help people. For 2 years, and a kid from Alabama, I saw different cultures and different attitudes and different ways of living and being, really in sort of a major way for the first time. So I came back with a big interest in people. At that same time, someone very close to me had an eating disorder, and she was out in Utah where I went to school. She was out there receiving inpatient care. And I became sort of a liaison between the facility and her family. And so the sort of the confluence of things led me to say, I love helping people. It's really rewarding to help my friend kind of beat this eating disorder. I love this. And so I'm gonna do psychology. Well, I finished an undergraduate in psychology. 3 days after I finish my undergrad, I start my PhD. At the ripe old age of 23, I'm giving advice to people on how to live their lives, as a therapist. And about 75% of the way through my PhD program, I just burned out. Like I was, already seeing a pretty full client load, had been for a couple of years, and I was just burning out. I was young, I had poor boundaries between me and my clients. And, you're meeting with people who are just dealing with heavy stuff like abuse and trauma and suicidality. And I was bringing it home in a very big way. And I was newly married at this time. And I was just like, I don't know that I need to do this, professionally. And so I came to my dad, who is to this day an advisor. And I said, look, I love studying human behavior. It's my passion still. I got that part right. But I don't know that I need to do it in a medical setting or like a clinical setting. And so what are some like non-clinical applications of psychology? And he goes, well, there's a ton of psychology in my work, which kind of shocked me at the time because I had always thought of my dad as, like one part salesperson, one part stock picker, kind of, I guess, is sort of how he was in my mind at that time. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like psychology in your work? And he kind of broke it down for me, pointed me in the direction of some books. And my dad like did not know the term behavioral finance or behavioral economics. He just knew that a big part of his job was helping his clients make good decisions and kind of keep them in their seat.
And this was around what age now?
Oh, I would have been 27, like 27, 28, like right as I'm finishing my PhD. And so, long story short, I from that sort of like seed of an idea, I fell in love with the work that I do today and basically tried to become a translator between the ivory tower of academia and people like my dad, right? Like people like financial advisors, boots on the ground, trying to help people make good decisions, and so trying to help advisors make good decisions that help keep their clients making good decisions.
And you've written, let's see, is it 2 books so far?
It's 3, but two that I'm proud of.
That's a funny way to put it. Okay.
Two that I like.
The first one was a test run.
No, the first one was good, but like, I mean, I find this. I always want, I always kind of cringe a little bit. Like, I feel like if you don't cringe a little bit when you read something you wrote 6 or 7 years ago, maybe I tell myself you're not growing enough. Maybe I just sucked then. I don't know.
That's where you should never pull up your Facebook memories and see what you wrote 10 years ago, right?
Right, right.
Yeah, I feel a little bit that way from my first podcast, and who knows, maybe I'll look back at some even today and look back and say, well, I could have done that lot better. But
Yeah.
am I wrong that you had another one coming soon?
So I just announced, last week, I think announced on a friend's podcast that I've signed a deal for a new book. The working title is The Soul of Money. I think that's probably going to change, but because there's another book by the same title, but it's all about lessons for life and money. Lessons that apply to living a better life that also apply to the world of finance. So moving in the direction of sort of my two loves, which is psychology and money.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think I told you I read that book called The Happy Money.
Hmm.
And then that was a big influencer in my life. And even I think looking back years and years ago, there was a TED talk called The Happiness Advantage.
Hmm.
Sean Aker, maybe.
Yep.
Ever since I watched that and started reading that, I just got fascinated with the topic.
Yeah.
So I imagine an awful lot of research goes into, all the studies and so forth when you're preparing to write a book. Do you remember anything particular from the research that you were doing that kind of popped or even maybe surprised you? I guess now we're thinking maybe I'm speaking to your most recent book, The Behavioral Investor, but you could reference any if you'd like.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that sticks with me was the goofy stuff, but like, there was one there was one study where it talked about people who had to pee and how they made different financial decisions than, people who did not. And it was because of this thing called inhibitory spillover. Like basically if you're holding it, right? If you're exercising self-restraint, that they found that self-restraint generalized to making financial decisions. Or like I speak Filipino. And so like there was one where people who speak a second language make better decisions in their non-preferred language because it causes them to slow down and sort of be more deliberative. So, it's easy, and then I'll get to like a more impactful one. But like with those two, it's easy to kind of say, well, that's goofy. Like that, like with the language one, it's like, well, that's not a very, like, what am I going to do? Like balance my checkbook in Filipino? But like, the sort of the finding is that patience and slowness and deliberation are conducive to good financial decision making. And that's something, whether or not you speak Spanish, like that's something that we can all all sort of benefit from. But one of the ones that I think about a lot was they had fMRI studies, so like brain scan studies of people who were exposed to different types of stimuli. And it was like all the good stuff, right? Like all the stuff you're not supposed to talk about at a party in kind of polite company, like sex, death, politics, religion, like all the kind of hot button stuff.
Sure.
And what they found is that money had more excitatory power than any of those, right? So like we get more bent out of shape thinking about and talking about money from an emotional perspective than even something like politics or religion or mortality, these sorts of things. And like that's a pretty compelling finding to me. When it comes to the centrality of getting your emotions in order from a financial perspective, I find myself reflecting on that a lot because I think it's self-evident to us that all that other stuff is excitatory, but I don't think we think, wow, like money sure makes me stupid because of how emotional I get about it.
Right. Well, and the way that I think a lot of us think too is that, oh, that's an interesting fact about everybody else.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't think that happens to me. Maybe we can get into that a little bit. That's probably a good segue into your book because I really enjoyed the format of your book. It was lots of stories, everyday examples, and it made it easy to relate to some of the information and these lessons that you were teaching. And additionally, at the end of each chapter, you had this section of where you summarize some of the key points. So you even had it divided up into, I think it was 4 separate parts, which I'm assuming all of that was intentional when you wrote the book or put this together. Is that to make it easier for the everyday layman to take this in?
Yeah. So I'm about 16 years in now to my, to my career in finance. And one of the mistakes that I made early on is even if you look at personalities, like some people are very detail oriented and sort of practical and tactical in the way that they think, and some people are much more big picture oriented and sort of philosophically minded. That's the camp that I fall into. Like I don't need anything to be practical. Like it's all just kind of interesting stuff to me. But I know many people find a lot of value in just the so what of it and like, okay, so what do we do with this? And those bullet points, I swear I get more positive feedback on those bullet point sections at the end of each chapter than anything else. Because it's easy to kind of get lost in the esoterica of all the studies and the philosophy of all this stuff.
Right.
Then at the end of the day, we want to be making better financial decisions with these things. And so I'm glad you noticed that and appreciated that because I've certainly found that to be the case.
Yeah, I've read a lot of stuff where it like you're saying, it's a lot of interesting stuff, but then what do you do with it? If you don't know what you're going to do with it, then it's just interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So let's I'll go into part 1 a little bit, and I'm going to quote here. You say, our theories about markets can only be as good as our understanding of human nature. So to me, that's just saying that in order to study markets, we have to study people. Is that kind of what I'm gathering from that?
Yeah. So, scientists of all stripes have to study the most fundamental unit of whatever constitutes the thing that they're studying, right? Like if you're studying physics, right, you have to study the behavior of, atomic particles and subatomic particles and, how do they sort of chunk up to make the physical reactions that we see today. And so for someone who studies markets, I think it's a little counterintuitive and revolutionary to say, the fundamental unit of markets is not money, it's not charts, it's not, the graphs or the index. The fundamental unit of markets is people, like, right? People dreamt up markets, people dreamt up, whether it's a business or a stock or a credit default swap or anything else, these are all human constructs. And until we understand humans, we're not going to understand sort of the big picture. And so I believe that humans are the fundamental units of markets. And so there's no understanding markets without understanding people.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it too, because I think our industry as a whole can really get caught up in the graphs and the charts and the data and almost leave the people out of it or the human nature out of it in some ways. You go on to illustrate that point that humans are wired to take action, but when it comes to investing, markets tend to reward inaction. So I guess the question would be, why is it just so hard to do nothing, even if we know that perhaps that's what's in our best interest?
One of the concepts, we're talking about the behavioral investor today, but one of the concepts that I introduced in the Laws of Wealth, the book previous, was something called Wall Street Bizarro World. And it's this idea that things that serve us well in life often serve us poorly in markets. So you look at something like action bias, which is what you're talking about. And if you want to get smarter, you should read more books, right? Like if you want to get stronger, you should lift more weights. If you want to get thinner, you should walk more miles, whatever, like it's just kind of like on and on. Like more is more, right? Like if you want to be happier, you should spend more time with your friends. Action consistently rewards us. And then you go to markets, and this has been studied in 19 different countries. And in 19 different countries, the finding has been the same every place. The more people do, the worse they do. The more people trade their accounts, the more people churn their accounts, the more people look at their statements, even. Like the more people do, the worse off they are. And this is so hard because it flies in the face of every other convention. Every other place in life is more. Like more effort leads to better results. And then you go to markets where, the average buy and hold investor will beat a professional fund manager. And like, where else would you see that? You and I couldn't go grab a bat and a ball and go beat the Yankees.
Sure.
And yet, grandma and grandpa can beat the average hedge fund manager if they're just patient. So it's kind of a wild thing, and it flies in the face of conventional wisdom.
Yeah. That kind of opens a whole can of worms a little bit, doesn't it? And probably makes a little bit of the, I guess, what you could call the traditional advisor that only did the investment management, doesn't really have a financial planning structure to their business. Kind of makes that person squirm a little bit, because I think that's an unsettling feeling for a lot of advisors and probably people alike, just that we're not beating the market.
Yeah, another thing that flies in the face of conventional wisdom though is it's just so hard to sit there. Like we know people that work with an advisor tend to do way better than those who don't. Like, research out of Canada shows that the average person who's advised for 15 years plus has 2.7 times the wealth of a similarly educated, similarly salaried peer who has gone without advice. And when you kind of drill down and look at that, you go, well, what happened? And it's not because the advisor is like picking the right stocks. It's not because the advisor is, Warren Buffett of Iowa or whatever. It's because that advisor has kept them in their seat and has kept them from making 2 or 3 catastrophic screw ups like over that time. And so it's a weird thing to say, like, hey, I'm going to pay this person a bunch of money to like just kind of keep me out of my own way. And yet it really works. Like, I mean, to an incredibly dramatic, at a dramatic level.
Right. And even with that, I sometimes wonder, who's keeping the advisors out of their own way too.
Well, this is a whole rabbit hole, but like advisors need advisors. And when you look at the research on financial advisor decision making with their own money, it's not great. Like
Sure.
when you look at the this is like the human condition though, man. Like this is if you're, if your friend is dating someone and you can tell they're not good for them, like you can tell, right? Like you can tell you're viewing that objectively and you're like, I don't know, man, doesn't seem great. Like, I see some problems, but when you're in a bad relationship, you're blind to it. Same thing with advisors and money, right? Advisors are consistently fantastic at helping their clients make clear-eyed financial decisions with their money. But when it's your money and it's your life, you're as dumb as the next person. So, it's a call for us to help each other out.
The disconnect, I suppose, is understanding that and acknowledging it too is a pretty humbling experience itself, right?
Yeah, and it's a weird thing because it takes acknowledging, like I work with an advisor. Like I work with my dad, right? So I work with my dad. My dad is my advisor. Now, I've written 3 books on investing. Like three bestsellers on investing. I'm writing a fourth, right? My dad knows lots. He's been in the industry for many years. He knows lots and he's good at some things I'm not good at, but there's certainly places where I know more than he does about the thing that I'm paying him to do for me. But I'm not paying him to be smarter than me. I'm paying him to keep me from like tripping over my feet. And it's a weird headspace to get in, to be like, wow, I know as much as this person about this thing, and yet I'm still going to pay them good money because it's going to matter. But I mean, think, does Tiger Woods, does Tiger Woods golf coach golf better than Tiger Woods? Like absolutely not. But still he can help him see things about his swing that he can't see himself. And you have to view it kind of like a coaching relationship, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So one thing I wanted to talk about briefly would be, if we looked back, as of this recording, at least in June of 2023, if we looked back at the last 6 months, the last 1 year, the last 5 years, over all of those timeframes, the market is up. And I think if we asked maybe 100 people out on the street, we'd probably get a lot gloomier outlook. Can you speak to that at all, of what causes that?
Yeah, so I'll tell a story. I don't think my Nana listens to your podcast. So I'll tell a story.
Fair enough.
I'll tell a story about my grandma. My grandma was here a couple, 6 weeks ago visiting, and she was like, "How's work? Because it's been a brutal year for markets." And I'm like, "Nana, the market's up 8% in, whatever, 5 months. Like that's fantastic. Like normally it goes up, on average 10% a year over long periods of time, like having a really good year." And she's like, "Well, what? Like, what about, and she couldn't believe it. And I had to show her. I'm like, "No, this is a great year." And there's a couple of reasons why this is the case. So, first of all, we know that bad news is 2.5 times stickier than good news. And this is consistent with a finding. This is like some of the seminal work that was done in the space, a theory called prospect theory that won Daniel Kahneman a Nobel Prize. But basically, he showed this asymmetry between how we perceive loss and reward. So if I give you $100, like you're like, "Oh, that's cool. Yeah, cool. Yeah, $100, nice." If I take $100 from you, you're gutted, right? Like it's not the same. Like we're much more upset about losing than we are about gaining. And the same thing applies to the stickiness of good news versus bad news. If you look at any individual day, right? The market's up on any given week, the market's up about 60% of the time and it's down about 40% of the time. Well, but what's 40 times 2.5, right? 40 times 2.5 is 100. So like if you're looking at the market every day or every week, it feels like it's constantly down. Like if you're looking at the market every day, you're going to see a lot of red. like a couple of times a week, it's going to be read and you're going to go, oh God, here we go. So part of it is just how we're wired to like hang on to bad news more than good news. And then the other thing is just there's a perverse incentive because of this tendency. There's a perverse incentive for news organizations to report bad news. Like it's the whole if it bleeds, it leads mentality. If they know that bad news is much going to get a lot more clicks and a lot more attention than good news, well, yeah, they're motivated by what we're all motivated by, which is trying to make a living, not a diss. Like they're gonna feature bad news at a much higher rate than they do good news. And so the combination of sort of bad news being overly represented in our news sources and it being overly sticky in our minds, it causes us to think that things are horrible even when they're actually quite good.
Yeah, and when I said over 6 months, 1 year, 5 year, over those time frames, we're all up, but we're not all the way back to our high point too.
Mm.
So I think sometimes, is that anchoring probably where that plays a little bit of effect where people are looking back at the best point and comparing it with that.
Yeah, so I'll tell a story on myself. Like I check my account more than I should, and I checked it today, and I was like, oh, I'm down, a decent number. When you have a little money, like a couple percentage points is meaningful dollar amount.
Sure.
Like, oh, bummer, like I'm down, X from my high, and I'm like, that stinks, but it's been a rough couple of days. And then I was at the gym this morning and on the financial news, they're like, June is going to go down as the best month in forever. And I'm like, oh yeah, like this has been a great month. But you frame it against the single highest point, like the single highest dollar amount. And it was just a good reminder to me. I'm like, I'm a lot better off for having had my money in the market during this month and this year, even though it's off the high. You really can't benchmark to those highs, and yet we do.
Right. Yeah, I just had a conversation with some clients this morning, and we always try to, take it from money and back it up to goals, and then even take it a step back further and really talk about values and let values drive the conversation. That might have been stolen from Carl Richards, or I don't know where I got that idea in the first place, but really making it a conversation about values and not as much about the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month movements of the market. But even still, that's tough because, as we're finding out, a lot of human tendency is just, we can't get out of our own way and we still want to check it.
Yeah.
Well, so that was a little bit of part one. Moving into part two, you labeled this investor psychology. And I thought this was really a fascinating section. And I love this quote, so I'll read it here. If you feel passionately about an investment idea, you probably haven't thought hard enough about it. So that was an interesting one. I'll have you speak more on that in a second. But you also listed next to this some other ideas that we might not love to hear about ourselves, such as, we seek out information that confirms our beliefs. When challenged, we often double down instead of taking the other side into consideration. And then also, the more ambiguous or unknown a situation is, the more certain we become, which obviously, rationally, you think it would be the opposite. The more unknown the situation, the less certain we are. So kind of all of that rolled into one. I guess the question would be, how do we get in our way so much? Or are we a little naive of our own shortcomings? What do we do about that? I don't know where you want to take that question.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'll begin with the sort of this idea that if you're excited, it's a bad idea. One of the things that I found, both through lived experience and in my research, is that deep understanding and deep emotion, oftentimes, when it comes to markets, not your kids or something, right? But like, deep understanding and deep emotion seldom coexist. And I mean, I even found that in my study of psychology. Like I was 23 when I was 23 when I started my PhD program. I was the youngest person ever at the time. I've since been bested, but I was the youngest person ever in the program. And I came in like thinking I knew a lot. Like with a bachelor's degree in psychology, I was like, I kind of get this. Like I kind of get this human nature thing. And then by the time I had a PhD, I was like, what's going on? Like, like what is that? Like, people are crazy, man. Like, I don't understand anything. And you see this a lot with markets. And I think the smartest people in the world, like if you're watching CNBC or something and they're interviewing a true market wizard, they're going to tell you, if pressed, like that they have no idea what's going to happen next. And that sort of humility is born of a lot of experience. We even see that in looking at investor confidence surveys. So you would think that confidence in investing would grow with age because, like, I mean, most things, right? You get more experience, if you look at your ability to change a tire or, do something else, all else equal, you're going to think more life leads to more confidence. In markets, it's the opposite. So people's confidence tends to fall as they age. Their confidence about like what's coming next in the markets. And that's just because markets make everybody look bad and they kind of teach us all lessons. And so, part of that humility comes from lived experience. When you look at sort of the specific types, I'll run with that one for a minute. When you look at the specific types of overconfidence that people exhibit, there's a couple. So one is thinking that we're better than average. This is the one that kind of gets all the press, like is, thinking we're smarter, better, faster, stronger, than the next person. But there's also others where it's like another form of overconfidence is thinking we're luckier than average. You ask, divorce rates are 50% in this country, but you go ask people like, hey, do you think you'll get divorced? And the answer is going to approach zero, right? Like,
Sure.
so it's like we think we're luckier than average, we think we're better than average, and we think we're more prescient about the future than we actually are. And so, some of the way that we erode this confidence is by self-study. Some of it is by learning and experience. But, the thing that I would say is that you have to understand that once again, overconfidence is baked in the cake. Overconfidence makes you happy.
Right.
Your job, right? Like your job has a failure rate of like 90%. If you were not overconfident, you would have never become a financial advisor. Like no one would ever start a restaurant. No one would ever ask a pretty girl on a date. Like, what I mean? It's just like any of these things, it takes a level of overconfidence for you to get started, and it helps get us out of bed in the morning. So there's no point at which we're all going to like perfectly titrate our levels of weighing probability. So basically, you do your best to overcome overconfidence, but then you just put yourself in situations where you don't need it. Like you diversify, right? Like diversification is the embodiment of sort of overconfidence managed. Like you work with a professional because like I'm going to get a second opinion. All of these things are sort of lived humility. And I think that building a life of lived humility is a much more powerful antidote for overconfidence than like soul searching, because I just think that there's limits to that.
Well, and it might go back to that point you made before where a lot of this may serve us well outside of investing, but then you bring these traits into investing and it doesn't quite work for us.
That's right.
I hope you are enjoying this conversation, but we are going to take a break here and we will have the second half for you in just 2 weeks. Also, at the beginning of this episode, I teased that we were going to do a little giveaway. So for the first 10 people who email us, we will be sending one of Daniel's books your way as our gift to you. just write the name Daniel Crosby in the subject line, and you can send that to hello@integrityguidance.com. You can find past episodes by visiting the podcast tab on our website, which is integrityguidance.com. That's all I have for you today, but I look forward to welcoming you back in 2 weeks for the conclusion of this conversation with Daniel Crosby. God bless.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, we would love if you took a quick moment to leave an honest review. Of course, we're shooting for 5 stars, but if you have suggestions to improve the show, we would love to hear from you too. Just click on the podcast name, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, and scroll down to ratings and review. Thanks again for your support, as this helps us reach a wider audience and help even more retirees just like you. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not intended as a specific tax, legal, or investment advice. Loren Sherman is a certified financial planner and co-owner of Integrity Wealth Management, an investment advisor serving retirees in search of their own healthy, wealthy, and wise retirement lifestyle.